In the dim light beneath the wing of a worn bomber, a man in grease-stained coveralls tightened the last bolts on a weapon no handbook had ever approved. The morning air was still, almost fragile, as if holding its breath while he worked. Metal clicked softly in his hands. Behind him, the war in the Pacific was collapsing, one failed tactic at a time. No one watching that scene could have guessed what those improvised guns would one day do. The Americans had tried everything. High-altitude bombing that missed its mark, medium-altitude runs that left crews exposed and dying, convoys slipped through the gaps, and every failure carried a weight measured in lives, not numbers. Yet here, far from the committees and specifications, a single mechanic-turned-pilot believed the answer was simpler. Hit lower, hit faster, hit harder. What he built on that quiet morning would soon rewrite the logic of naval warfare. But how did an unauthorized idea, born in the dust of a remote airfield, end up destroying thousands of enemy troops in barely 15 minutes? To understand that transformation, we have to return to the moment when desperation met innovation and history bent under the force of one man's resolve. In the months before that quiet morning on the airfield, the war in New Guinea had taken on a grim rhythm. Convoys moved freely across the sea. American and Australian forces, stretched thin across jungle outposts and crude airstrips, could only watch as Japanese reinforcements arrived almost unchallenged. The official tactics had failed. The men on the ground knew it. The pilots who flew the missions felt it even more. The heart of the problem was simple. Bombers were never meant to fight at the altitude where survival depended on raw nerve. High above the clouds, they were safe but useless against maneuvering ships. At medium height, they became perfect targets. And down low, where accuracy finally improved, they lacked the forward firepower to silence enemy guns before being torn apart. The crews paid the price for these contradictions. Reports of pilots lost while following the textbook became painfully common. The stories were nearly identical: a clean approach, a steady bomb run, then a burst of fire from a transport or destroyer, and the bomber never returned. These were not reckless men. They were following a doctrine built for another kind of war. Among the officers who saw the truth most clearly was a middle-aged captain named Paul Pappy Gunn. Before the war, he had flown civilians across the Philippines and maintained his own aircraft. When the Japanese invaded, his world burned overnight. His family was captured in Manila. He escaped to Australia with little more than the clothes he wore and a quiet determination to strike back however he could. Rules mattered less to him now. Results mattered more. He spent long nights in salvage yards, searching through the wreckage of fighters that would never fly again. What he pulled from those broken machines were the pieces of an answer. Heavy machine guns, wiring that could be repurposed, steel that could be reshaped. He knew the bombers needed teeth, and no regulation was going to provide them in time. The first real proof came with the A-20 light bomber. Gunn and a handful of mechanics removed the bombardier's station and bolted 50 caliber guns into the nose. Fuel lines and ammunition feeds were improvised from whatever parts survived the salvage piles. None of it was standard, all of it was risky, but the aircraft that rolled onto the runway was something new. Not a bomber waiting for fighters to protect it, but a Predator built to dive low, fire first, and survive. When those modified A-20 seconds roared into combat for the first time, they hit a Japanese airfield at dawn. The low attack caught the defenders off guard. Fighters still parked on the runway, burned under the burst of heavy guns. Fuel trucks erupted. Ammunition stores ignited. What mattered most was this: every American aircraft returned home. The message was unmistakable. Low-level attack could work, but only with overwhelming forward firepower. That realization would soon push Gunn, and the men who believed in him, toward a weapon far more powerful than the A-20. A weapon that would force the enemy to rethink everything they believed about naval protection. As the war pressed deeper into the Pacific, the modified A-20 seconds proved one thing beyond debate. Forward firepower changed everything. But the A-20 was still a light bomber with limited range and payload. The Allies needed something larger, something that could fly farther, hit harder, and survive the kind of missions where every second of exposure meant life or death. For General George Kenney, that answer was the B-25 Mitchell. The aircraft had potential, but in its standard form, it was trapped in the same limitations that doomed earlier bombers. Two forward-firing guns were not enough to silence deck crews or break the accuracy of anti-aircraft fire. Gunn understood this immediately. He also understood the risks. The moment he tore out the bombardier's compartment and began reinforcing the nose with steel plates and heavy machine guns, he stepped beyond every regulation the Army Air Forces had ever written. The first Strafer prototype took shape under harsh lights in a makeshift workshop. Panels came off, plexiglass nose sections disappeared, ammunition boxes were welded into place, cables, feeds, and chutes were routed through the frame like veins. Gun added gun blisters along the sides, then 2 more guns under the cockpit. 8 in total, all firing forward, all controlled by a single button under the pilot's thumb. It was not elegant. It was not approved. But it was devastating. When the aircraft took to the sky for its initial test, the recoil shook the frame so violently that rivets snapped and panels buckled. Yet the guns held their aim. 8 streams of fire merged into a single torrent, powerful enough to peel steel from a ship's hull. The handling problems were real, and the risks were obvious. But Gunn and his team worked relentlessly to stabilize the design. They moved equipment aft, added ballast to the tail, and removed defensive turrets that no longer mattered in a low-level fight. The B-25 became nose-heavy but manageable, and the firepower it carried dwarfed anything in the theater. By early 1943, 12 Strafer B-25 seconds were delivered to Major Edward Lana's 90th Bomb Squadron. Lana saw immediately what they represented, a weapon built not for doctrine but for survival. He trained his men the way a fighter squadron trains. Altitude was no longer measured in thousands of feet but in tens. Speed, angle, timing, the essentials of a low-level run were drilled until instinct replaced caution. The pilots learned to trust their aircraft, even as they wrestled with its new weight and the turbulence created by its own guns. While they trained, intelligence officers tracked a looming threat. A Japanese convoy was assembling at Rabaul, preparing to move nearly 7,000 troops to New Guinea. If those reinforcements reached the front lines, the Allies would face a new and far stronger enemy. And so the stage was set, a massive convoy moving south, a new kind of bomber waiting on the ground, and a battle that would test whether Gunn's illegal design could stand against one of the largest troop movements Japan had attempted. The moment was approaching when innovation would collide with necessity, and the fate of an entire campaign would hinge on the decisions made by a handful of pilots flying barely above the waves. Dawn on the 3rd of March 1943 broke over the Bismarck Sea with no hint of what was coming. The water lay calm beneath the Japanese convoy. 8 transports packed with soldiers, 8 destroyers guarding their flanks, and a sky they believed they controlled. They had reasons for confidence. High-altitude bombing had failed them before, and Allied aircraft rarely struck with enough precision to stop a moving force at sea. What they did not know was that the attack approaching them had been reshaped by desperation, anger, and a mechanic's refusal to accept the limits of official doctrine. The first wave arrived from above. B-17 seconds dropped their bombs from medium altitude, scattering explosions across the convoy's perimeter, but scoring few decisive hits. Japanese fighters surged upward to meet them, dragging air cover away from the sea. It was a familiar pattern. But the real blow was still below the clouds, racing across the waves. The second wave came in at wave-top height. Australian Beaufighters skimmed the surface, firing cannon shells that ripped through bridges, fire control stations, and exposed crews. Their attack left the convoy stunned. Many anti-aircraft guns were angled too high, built to track threats from above, not predators striking from the horizon. For a few seconds, there was only confusion, metal clanging, officers shouting, ships turning without orders. Then, the Strafer B-25 seconds arrived. Major Edward Lana led the first element, 3 bombers flying so low that their propellers seemed to cut lines across the sea. At 1,000 yards, Lana pressed the trigger. The 8 .50 caliber guns answered as one. The sound was a violent, physical force that filled the cockpit. Tracers raked the nearest transport, slicing through steel, shattering bridge windows, cutting down every crewman trying to reach a gun mount. Within moments, the ship was blind, leaderless, and unable to steer. At 300 yards, Lana released his bombs. They struck the water, skipped like stones, and slammed into the hull at the waterline before detonating deep inside the cargo decks. The transport broke apart in less than 3 minutes. Hundreds of soldiers never reached daylight. His wingmen hit 2 more transports. One lost its boilers in a burst of steam and fire. Another took a blast amidships that opened a 20-foot wound. Lifeboats toppled. Men leapt into the sea. The convoy that had been tightly organized only minutes earlier dissolved into chaos. Behind Lana, more B. 25 seconds, pressed their runs. Destroyers tried to maneuver, but many had already lost their bridge crews. One vessel, attempting to evade, collided with a damaged transport. Both were doomed. By the time the final strafer pulled away, the sea behind them was a field of burning oil, overturned lifeboats, and collapsing hulls. The crushing reality settled quickly. More than 3,000 Japanese troops were gone. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers lost, 2 more crippled. What had begun as a reinforced march to strengthen the front in New Guinea had turned into one of the most catastrophic defeats Japan suffered at sea. For the Allies, the cost was not small. Airmen lost, aircraft gone, but it was nowhere near the scale of what they had inflicted. The balance of the New Guinea campaign shifted permanently in those 14 minutes, and every part of it traced back to the decision to break the rules, add more guns, and bring the fight down to the surface of the sea. In the hours after the battle, the scale of the victory rippled far beyond the waters of the Bismarck Sea. Across Allied headquarters, messages poured in damage reports, reconnaissance updates, and early assessments of what the loss meant for Japan. But in the United States, thousands of miles away, the first reaction was disbelief. Engineering officers at Wright Field had warned repeatedly that the modified B-25 seconds were unsafe. Now, those same aircraft had returned from one of the most intense, low-level attacks of the Pacific War, with all crews accounted for. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Inside Washington, the discussion turned quickly from regulations to results. General Hap Arnold, who had once relied on the caution of his engineers, now faced evidence that broke every assumption of traditional bomber doctrine. The Strafer B-25 had done what no standard design had ever achieved. It had dominated a convoy defended by destroyers and fighter cover, and it had done so in minutes, not hours. The question shifted from whether the modifications were acceptable to how soon they could be standardized. In that moment, American air strategy bent decisively toward innovation, driven from the front lines. For Japan, the consequences were immediate and severe. The report filed by the captain of Submarine 126 made its way into Imperial Navy intelligence. His account described an attack so sudden and overwhelming that resistance was nearly impossible. Low-flying bombers, he warned, were now the greatest threat to any daylight convoy. The conclusion was stark. No reinforcement group should attempt to cross contested waters under the sun again. This single shift crippled Japan's ability to sustain its forces in New Guinea, where isolation soon became as lethal as combat itself. The wider world saw something else, a turning point in the Pacific War's air-sea dynamic. Allied commanders in other theaters studied the coordinated use of Beaufighters A-20 seconds and B-25 seconds with renewed interest. Low-level attack was no longer an experiment. It was a proven doctrine. Squadrons across the Pacific began requesting Strafer configurations. Even in Europe, where different threats shaped the battlefield, air crews took note of what concentrated forward fire could achieve against hardened positions. What began as an unauthorized field modification had reshaped the strategic landscape. It showed that adaptation, quick, risky, improvised, could alter the trajectory of an entire campaign. And it reminded every nation watching that the war would be won not only by factories and headquarters, but by the men who refused to accept limits when lives depended on change. When the sea finally calmed and the smoke drifted away, the wreckage of the convoy told a story that would echo far beyond the South Pacific. It was not simply the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new understanding of how wars are won. The men who flew those low-level runs returned to their airfields exhausted, shaken, and changed. Yet none of them claimed the moment as their own. They pointed instead to the mechanic, who had handed them a weapon capable of turning the tide. Paul Papy Gunn never looked the part of a revolutionary. He had no engineering team, no formal authority, and no interest in recognition. What he had was conviction. He saw a problem that was costing lives and refused to wait for permission to solve it. His ideas were hammered into shape with scavenged steel and sleepless nights, tested not in laboratories, but in the violent air above the ocean. And in the end, they worked. They saved crews who would have died under the old doctrine. They reshaped the B-25 into an aircraft feared across the Pacific. They changed the course of entire campaigns. Yet history does not always keep track of the men who work in grease and shadows. Gunn's name rarely appeared in official records. His innovations were absorbed into production lines, manuals, and tactics without the story of how they began. Even the grave that now carries his rank and service says nothing of the thousands of lives altered by his determination. But his legacy survives in the aircraft that still stand in museums, their solid noses and forward guns quietly telling the truth. Someone, somewhere, chose to break the rules at the exact moment it mattered most. For those who study the Pacific War, the lesson remains as sharp today as it was in 1943. Progress is often born from uncertainty. Courage comes not only from the cockpit but from the workshop, from the willingness to challenge what has always been done. And every battle contains a moment when a single decision made by a commander, a pilot, or a mechanic bends history in a new direction. If this story speaks to you, share your thoughts below. What lessons do you see in the risks these men took? And which forgotten figures of the war deserve to be remembered next? Thank you for watching. The battles may be long over, but the history is still being written,